Today we're going to be talking about audiolingualism and how it affected other ideas of how second languages should be learned. Audiolingualism transpired from three main historical circumstances. Firstly being people's changing views of how second languages should be acquired, behaviorism becoming more popular and people beginning to experiment with behaviorism as a method for acquiring a second language, and thirdly, the need for soldiers in World War II to be stationed all over the world with some knowledge and skill in a foreign language. The audiolingualism of language learning passed through several important events in history and led to a much needed change in the way that second languages were acquired. It may not have been the best method for students learning a second language, but it did take a step away from grammar and translation in the right direction towards better communication in a second language. Audiolingualism was coined by Professor Nelson Brooks in 1964, but first appeared in the United States during World War II in the mid-1900s. It was designed to provide a quick, structured method for learning how to communicate in a specific language. And it is often referred to as the Army method since it was specifically created for soldiers who were placed in different countries and needed to communicate in that native language. The Army method, like many other learning methods, branched off from V.F. Skinner's behavioristic theory that learning is a function of change in overt behavior, where behaviors are the result of an individual's response to events, stimuli, that occur in the environment. During this time, the grammar translation method was the most commonly used method for learning a language, where basically the students would translate passages from a foreign language word for word in their own language. People were realizing, however, that this process took a long time, and even after mastering it, students came out without the ability to speak the language well. Thus, the idea that learning a second language was similar to gaining a new habit came into play, which brought about audiolingualism. Audiolingualism, like behaviorism, is a process of repetition and positive or negative reinforcement. Within this method, language is looked at through the eyes of conditioning. A stimulus from the teacher leads to either a correct response from the students, followed by a positive reinforcement from the teacher, or an incorrect response followed by a negative reinforcement from the teacher. This method has four main drills of pattern practices: repetition, inflection, replacement, and restatement. During the repetition drill, students are to repeat an utterance immediately after the teacher says it. In the inflection drill, teachers will tell the students to restate the previously stated utterance with a different inflection, thus changing a sentence from present to past. The replacement drill is simply replacing one of the words in an utterance with another word in the same lexical category. And lastly, the restatement drill is where students simply rephrase the utterance. This method of teaching was the dominant foreign language teaching method in the United States from about 1947 to 1967. Audiolingualism takes from both structural linguistics and the direct method. Structural linguistics came from Leonard Bloomfield's point of view as an American linguist. It focuses heavily on utterances and breaking the utterance down syntactically, morphologically, and phonetically. While audiolingualism focuses on those aspects, its main focus is on the grammar of utterances. The other method that audiolingualism takes from is the direct method, which advises that students should be taught a language directly, only using the target language. The major difference between audiolingualism and the direct method is that the audiolingual method does not focus on teaching vocabulary, but instead drilling students in the use of grammar. Both of these methods focus heavily on correct pronunciation and order. They both fit into the get it right from the beginning philosophy, which we talked about earlier, meaning that when using these methods, mistakes are viewed as bad and should be avoided at all costs. Because language is viewed as an acquired habit, students that make mistakes early on will continue to make them throughout the whole learning process and will not be able to avoid them. This, however, is far from the truth. In many cases, we have seen that students tend to learn from their mistakes and often improve most in areas that they were first making mistakes. The word audiolingualism can be broken down into three meanings. Audio meaning listen, lingual meaning speech, and ism meaning system or philosophy. Thus, audiolingualism is the listen-speak system. This method takes on an oral-based approach where students are required to only speak in the target language. A typical session starts with the teacher creating a scenario and reenacting the scene twice or more in front of the students. Then he will have the class repeat line for line exactly what he had said during the act. As he has them repeat after him, he divides the class into different groups and then has the individual groups repeat after him until they have all said it correctly. During this time, he might call on different individuals to repeat it alone. This allows the teacher the ability to help correct students individually when they say something wrong. The teacher then has them repeat the dialogue exactly how he had said it, including the same emphasis. Once he has gone through the whole act with the students, he pretends to be one of the characters from the act and has all the students pretend to be the other character. During this phase, the students must say everything exactly the way that their character had said it previously. After this, the teacher has two students volunteer to reenact the scene, with one person being the one character and the other being the other character. Once they have finished going through the whole act correctly, he chooses words to switch out in the sentences. For example, if the student had been saying, "I like to clean," the teacher might say walk, and the students have to use the word walk in the original sentence, thus saying, "I like to walk." The last sections of the grammar sections are the grammar sections, focusing on using the correct parts of speech in the correct order in the sentence. The goal of this method is to be able to make communicating in the target language automatic, with no stuttering or pausing to think. This method works well for having automatic responses during certain situations, but outside of those situations, communicating becomes problematic. God did not create humans to have an exact response to a certain stimulus. He created everyone different with the ability to communicate and create never-before-heard sentences. One of the core qualities of language is that it allows for stimulus freedom. While we generally do have certain responses to questions like, "How are you?" we do not have to follow the expected response to this question. We're not bound to a certain response. In 1959, Noam Chomsky, also known as the father of modern linguistics, wrote a review of B.F. Skinner's verbal behavior, saying that children have the innate biological ability to learn language and do not learn languages simply by repetition and reward. After that, others started to question the scientific credibility of behaviorism and all the ideas and methods that came with it. This led to a rapid decline in the popularity of audiolingualism. And around the 70s, Philip Smith's study, the Pennsylvania Project, proved audiolingualism to be less effective than cognitive approaches that involve using the learner's first language while learning. It is very difficult for students to learn the backings of a second language without being taught it in the first language. Within the audiolingual method, there is no explicit teaching of grammar. Everything is just memorized in form, thus making it hard to understand. When learning a second language, we need to understand that vocabulary and grammar cannot simply be memorized. Although the Army method faded out soon after Chomsky's review, portions of the method are still used in language teaching today. The method as a whole is not a reliable method for student development in a language. However, mixing it with more developed methods of teaching, like the communicative approach, will most likely benefit the students. Repetition of a language does help with pronouncing the phonology of a language, but when it comes to conversing with others in the target language, students need more than what the audiolingual method provides. They need real-world experiences and interactions with other native speakers to really progress and communicate well. Audiolingualism is a prime example of going from one extreme to another. It went from grammar translation, which only focused on reading and writing, to the audiolingual method, which mainly focused on listening and speaking. Using these methods alone will not be sufficient enough for someone to learn a second language. However, using them together or with other teaching methods will provide someone with the four main qualities of a language: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Even though audiolingualism would not work well for students learning in a classroom setting, it did provide a fast solution for preparing the soldiers with a little vocabulary and intelligence of the languages before going into a foreign country. Also, it may have proven to be less beneficial than traditional cognitive approaches, but teachers were able to learn from their mistakes and take bits and pieces from the method which are still used to this day. The end.